Hey, it's Greg Brown, the storyteller, poet laureate of aviation. Grab your logbook, 'cause it's time for another flying carpet cockpit adventure. I'm an aviation author, photographer, former National Flight Instructor of the Year, and Barnes & Noble Arizona Author of the Month. The flying carpet is a single-engine light airplane in which my wife Jean and I travel the North American continent, searching behind clouds for the real America. Learn more at my website, gregbrownflyingcarpet.com, where you can also see photos from most episodes. Flight instructing offers some of the most fulfilling flying there is. We experience the joy of delivering our students' dreams of flight, become better pilots ourselves in the process, and develop lifelong friendships with many of those we teach. But among hours and hours of routine teaching and flying, there are occasional hard lessons too, most often unanticipated. And those hard lessons are generally even more eye-opening and profound for us instructors than they are for our students. Above all, we learn that while maintaining a relaxed and productive cockpit learning environment, we must never become complacent. Okay, everyone, hop aboard my flying carpet, buckle into the pilot's seat, and prepare for takeoff on flight number 36, Bowling Alley Hot Dogs. Clear prop. By the time I'd been flight instructing for 5 or 6 years, I had learned that it offered some of my most rewarding flying. Not only did I enjoy introducing others to the skies, but my own piloting skills benefited in the process. Opportunities arose to master many different types of airplanes, and after journeying with students from my Indiana base at the time to South Dakota and Arizona, I found myself increasingly in demand to travel with them. Best of all, in teaching others to fly, I met many interesting and colorful characters. So far, there had been relatively few scares while teaching. Most students respond predictably to various flight situations, I'd quickly discovered. I'd also found that similar errors can be expected of most students when learning any given maneuver. It helps that in airplanes, mistakes rarely happen fast enough to require hair-trigger response. The majority of flight training is done far from the ground, meaning that instructors have the luxury of time when correcting mistakes. For this reason, I'd much rather teach in airplanes than cars. Nasty surprises do sometimes occur, however, when students do something dangerously unpredictable near the ground, or in a few other critical situations. One of my best flight students, for example, quit the controls during a night touch-and-go landing on a narrow runway edged by snowbanks. I'll never know why the otherwise confident student chose that moment to throw up his hands and stop flying, but in any case, I grabbed the controls barely in time to avoid clipping a wing on a snowbank. Then there was the time during a flight review when an older pilot released the rudder while practicing power-on stalls in a Cessna 210. Instantly, we entered one of the most vicious spins I've ever encountered, putting me for the second time in my career into test pilot territory. Fortunately, I was able to recover uneventfully. A surprising number of emergencies are pilot-induced, like the time I was instructing an experienced pilot in the traffic pattern at Fort Wayne. We'd flown there on a night training mission, and after grabbing a bite to eat, took off again to practice landings. Barely had my student leveled the plane in the traffic pattern when a loud and vicious banging began, suggesting that the plane was either falling apart or someone was trying to get in the door. So resonant was this noise that we could feel it through our seats as well as hear it. I advised the control tower of our problem and asked permission to circle for a few minutes while we tried to figure out what was wrong. This being a retractable gear airplane, I did not want to attempt landing without knowing whether all 3 wheels were extended. At the same time, we had no urge to linger aloft in case either a failing engine or some structural problem with the airplane was causing the noise. While taking turns at the controls, the two of us tried frantically to identify the source of the banging, but without success. All we could determine was that the noise diminished whenever we slowed the airplane. After a low pass in front of the tower to confirm that the landing gear was down, we were cleared to land. We touched down uneventfully, at which time the banging stopped immediately. We taxied off the runway to where emergency vehicles were waiting and shut down the engine. There, upon opening the door, I discovered the source of the noise that had so alarmed us. Dangling out the bottom of my cabin door lay the shredded sleeve of my new windbreaker, which my wife Jean had bought me just the week before for Christmas. Inadvertently, I had closed the door on the coat, leaving the sleeve dangling outside to slap rapidly against the fuselage in the slipstream. Similar distractions sometimes result from seatbelt straps being closed in an airplane door, but this had been so much louder that I never made the connection. We secured the coat in the back seat and took off for Lafayette, our home base. The worst aftermath of this scare came at home, when Jean saw the remains of my new Christmas coat. Anyway, one of my more colorful flight students owned a pristine Piper Cherokee, low-wing counterpart of the Cessna 172. John, a would-be fighter pilot, actually wore a military flight suit and flying gloves to instrument flying lessons in his small single-engine airplane. Despite the unusual outfit, or perhaps because of it, John proved to be an outstanding student of blind flying. He arrived thoroughly prepared for each lesson and exhibited exceptional powers of concentration, making for performance far better than average in this difficult art. John was a neatness and an organization fanatic, well beyond the actual flying of the plane. On any given Saturday, he could be found at the airport, vacuuming the newly upholstered interior of his Cherokee, or maybe touching up minuscule paint imperfections, or polishing microscopic bugs from the wing leading edge. This was a man who invested much of every weekend scrubbing seams and rivets on the underbelly of his airplane with a toothbrush, and who disassembled the instrument panel to scour joints and corners where invisible bits of grime might accumulate. John and I breezed through his instrument training with few setbacks, and I found myself consistently impressed by his rock-steady performance under the training hood. No disturbance or simulated emergency I could contrive succeeded in distracting him. Clearly, if the guy was going to dress like a military pilot, he also intended to fly like one, and I certainly couldn't fault him for that. A cross-country lesson is required of every training instrument pilot, and when the time came for John to do that, we decided to go somewhere special. We waited for a good, cloudy instrument flying day, loaded up the Piper's back seat with John's teenage son and his son's friend, and took off for Kalamazoo, Michigan, to visit the Ayers Zoo Aviation Museum on the field. The first leg of our flight went well. John piloted us through clouds the whole way, and at Kalamazoo made the first of 3 instrument approaches required on this lesson. As usual, he was organized, thorough, and unflappable throughout the trip. Upon landing, the 4 of us spent several enjoyable hours at the Airplane Museum. Then we headed across the street to consume hot dogs at a nearby bowling alley before heading home. The weather had deteriorated during our visit, so upon departing Kalamazoo, we endured not only immersion in clouds, but a wet and bumpy ride as well. Rain now assaulted our diminutive craft, and the cloud vapor obscuring our windows oscillated wildly between shades of darkness and daylight. It was the perfect training environment for a soon-to-be all-weather aviator, and my prize student met the challenge admirably by maintaining course and altitude. Unlike many new instrument pilots under such difficult conditions, John even seemed to be enjoying himself. He shot his second required instrument approach at Rensselaer, then turned us southward toward Lafayette and home. Nearing Purdue Airport, we were cleared for our third and final approach through the clouds for landing. As usual, John had organized his charts well in advance. He studied them yet again, and he tuned the radios as required. This was before GPS, and for you pilots, this was a non-precision VOR approach. John was to descend a fixed course in a stair-step manner, first to step-down altitude, and then to minimum descent altitude, where we would stay until the airport hopefully came into sight. Using flawless technique, John made the appropriate radio report and began our descent toward the step-down altitude. We would soon be home. I put my hands behind my head and relaxed, taking seemingly well-deserved pride in my students' excellent flying and in my own expert instructing. We were just a few hundred feet above the step-down altitude, descending rapidly through the clouds and ready to begin level off when the only disaster that could possibly phase my unflappable flight student occurred. I guess the combination of greasy bowling alley hot dogs and 2 hours of bumping around in the soup hadn't done much for the two forgotten teens in the back seat. First one boy and then the other began vomiting violently on the new upholstery. When John realized what was happening, he turned suddenly around and began yelling at the boys. Gripping the control wheel as he turned, he unwittingly rolled the plane into a steep bank, veering it off course and accelerating our descent. Down we plunged. By the time I'd untangled my hands from behind my head and lunged for the controls, we were plummeting obliquely through our step-down altitude toward the ground. Probably it only took seconds to regain control and climb back on course, but to me the process took an eternity. Grab the control wheel. Mentally process our flight attitude from the instruments. Level the wings, raise the nose, apply power, climb, turn, level off, intercept course. Since we were still enveloped by clouds, John, in his distraction, didn't even realize what was happening. Once I safely reestablished our plane on course, emotion and logic began battling for my attention. The only thing scarier than seeing yourself plummet toward the ground, I found myself thinking, is plummeting toward ground you cannot see. Rationally, I knew we'd approached nowhere near the ground. But emotionally, I had been within millimeters of it. How close were we? Certainly, it would have taken less than a minute to get there, but that would still be plenty of time to recover. I looked at my student, who was still focused on events in the back seat, then banished further speculation from my mind. Twice I urged John to retake the controls, but the man was so flustered that I elected to complete the flight myself. Throughout the approach, landing, and taxi to the ramp, he continued berating the boys and attempting to clean up the mess. Not until we shut off the engine and got out did John calm down enough to admit he shouldn't have allowed himself to get distracted from flying the plane. What would have happened had you been alone with the boys? I asked him. Silent for a moment, John then replied somberly, I don't know. Good thing you were there, I guess. After gradually reestablishing communication, we talked long and hard about what had happened. In visual flying conditions, John would have noticed immediately the steep turn he'd caused and corrected it. But in clouds, even the most experienced pilot must rely on instruments to control the airplane's attitude. That's why breaking concentration even for a moment can be deadly when flying instruments. Then there's the fact that sudden head movements cause vertigo, as I had so effectively learned many years before when flying motorcycle parts home in the snow. John's sudden turn to face the boys had added to his disorientation. Once losing control, odds do not favor the pilot in regaining it. It's provocative to consider how many accidents happen due to minor distractions like a flapping coat, an open door, or a sick passenger. Again, I was reminded that pilots who live to learn from their errors rarely make the same mistakes again. After overcoming the trauma of such lessons, I was always pleased that the student experienced them for the first time with an instructor on board, even if the experience was stressful for me. "Aren't you glad this happened?" I asked John after we'd relived the incident from every possible angle. "Yeah, I guess I'm glad it happened," he said. His voice strengthened. "I'll certainly never make a mistake like that again." "Good," I said. "Then it was a worthwhile lesson in every respect." Now it began drizzling. Quickly we agreed on the date for our next lesson and walked briskly toward our respective cars. "I'm going to buy 6-acts for the airplane," said John as he walked away. "Can't believe I didn't get some before." I waved and, wanting to stay dry, kept walking. "Greg," called John as he entered his car. Covering my head with my jacket, I turned to look. "Ever price seat covers?" he asked. Thanks for riding along on today's Flying Carpet adventure. Find photos from most episodes at gregbrownflyingcarpet.com. While there, check out my aviation adventure book, Flying Carpet, The Soul of an Airplane, for which I was named Barnes & Noble Arizona Author of the Month. You'll also find my other aviation books there, and my Views from the Flying Carpet aerial photography available in fine art metal prints. Please support this podcast by sharing your favorite episodes on social media, posting reviews on your favorite podcast directories, and donating via gregbrownflyingcarpet.com. I welcome your feedback via my website, via my Flying Carpet Podcast Facebook group, or the fan mail link in your favorite podcast app. Finally, follow my social media sites by searching Greg Brown Flying Carpet, and consider joining my Student Pilot Pep Talk Facebook group. Thanks, Carter Olson, for the tagline. Music by Hannes Brown. See you next time.